I'd like to pay my respects to the Taungurung people and their elders, past and present, and extend that to all the First Nations people across the area that BioLinks work across Central Victoria, and any First Nations people in the audience tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge all of our supporters and donors. If any of you are here tonight, the work that we do at BioLinks would not be possible without your support, so thank you. A little bit of housekeeping. We are recording this meeting tonight, so please be aware of that. Keep your microphones muted, keep your cameras off, and the recording will be shared following the webinar tonight. We'll have a Q&A at the end. If any questions pop into your mind throughout the presentation, please pop them in the chat. We'll keep an eye on that, and we'll get those questions to Lisa at the end in a Q&A session. And that's all the housekeeping. So I'm very excited about tonight's topic, all about bats and the Central Victorian bats in particular. And evidently you guys are as well, because this one booked out in no time. We've just recently begun monitoring microbats at our Spring Plains project. So it's a topic that I'm super keen to jump into, and really stoked to have Associate Professor Lisa Godinho from the University of Melbourne here tonight to introduce us into the world of bats. And Lisa's also been involved with BioLinks Alliance's Heathcote Local to Landscape project. So it's great to welcome her here to present for us tonight. Thanks, Lisa.
Beautiful. Thanks, Chris. And hello, everyone. Thank you for taking some time out on this Wednesday evening to come and join me. I'm on Wurundjeri country, so I too would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people and acknowledge their ongoing connection to and custodianship of the land that I live and work on. And I'm also privileged to spend a bit of time on Taungurung country as well, as Chris mentioned, part of the Heathcote community. So yeah, it's really great to be able to have those connections, and certainly it plays a big role in the work that I do at the moment, which is working with young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, providing pathways through an undergraduate science degree. And so lots of work that I do now is really thinking about the connections and future of science with knowledge that should rightly have been part and has been unacknowledged in its role that it's played in science in Australia up until this point. So really excited to think about how we can shape the future together with more respectful relationships in this field. But today I am here to talk to you a little bit about a field of research that I spent about a decade in and still am very passionate about, a group of animals that are cryptic, that we don't get to spend a lot of time with, that are around us all the time. Even as I sit here in my office in Melbourne, they are flying over the building, I'm sure, but really important parts of the ecology of the landscapes that we're trying to reconnect. And I'm sure you're all doing your best through the BioLinks Alliance to be able to contribute to that. So these animals are the only mammals that are capable of powered flight. The reason that we don't see them so often is because most of them are very small and they come out at night. And although they're making an incredible racket as they're flying around above our heads, we don't generally get to hear them because the sounds that they're making are well above our hearing range. And so despite the fact that if we could tune in, the night sky would be a racket, most of these animals are capable of making sounds that are equivalent in decibels to a jet engine. But thankfully, that is sitting well above our hearing range, so we do get our peace and quiet. But I would like to introduce you to one animal in particular. We'll start with this animal who we can hear. And so I'm going to play you a sound that hopefully you will recognise if you've been out and about on a warm summer's evening or even a warm autumn evening. This might be a sound that you've heard. So hopefully some people, I know you've been asked to keep your cameras off, that are maybe nodding and thinking, yeah, we've heard that. This amazing sound belongs to an animal called the white-striped free-tailed bat. Here it is here. So this is one of the largest microbats that we have in Victoria. And it's an animal that is audible to us because its call is one of the lowest. So it sits around the 11 kilohertz mark, and so it means that it falls into the human hearing range. So even though, yes, it's still using echolocation and still calling in order to navigate in the way that all the other microbats are as well, this one happens to call low enough that we can tune in. And so you're able to hear in that call sequence changes in the frequency of that call, which tell us a little bit about its behaviour too. And some of you may have been out with teams that are doing microbat monitoring. I know that you said, Chris, that that's potentially starting up at Spring Plains. One of the ways that we can work out what bats are in an area and even learn something about their behaviour is by listening to those calls. And those calls are effectively a way in which those animals can visualise the world around them when vision is just not good enough. So they're often flying at speed. The white-striped freetail, this beautiful animal in particular, is a really fast flyer. So they've been clocked at 60 kilometres an hour, which means they're generally out in the open, very difficult to navigate when you're flying at that speed. So you tend not to be in amongst the trees, you tend to be above them or out in the open areas. And so they are calling in a way that allows them to visualise their environment through sound. So as they scream, and it is really loud, but thankfully most of them are beyond our hearing range. So they're screaming out into the night. It's a laryngeal. Their voice box is making the sound and then listening for the echo to come back. So when that sound wave hits something solid, it will bounce back and hit the bat in the face. And then they can listen to that echo and understand something about their environment. And their brain is capable of forming an image based on that soundscape that returns to them through the echoes. So the more frequently they call, the more the picture is clear to them as to what's in their surroundings. And so you will hear changes in the frequency of the call based on what the bat is doing. So it may be that if the bat's trying to catch something, that you'll hear that the sound speed up and you'll get more frequent calls. Or if they're just in a search phase or they're flying their generic commuting route, because bats do often commute along pretty standard what we call flyways through the landscape. So when they're doing that, they're like, yeah, I did this last night and the night before and the night before that. So I don't need to call that often because I know where I'm going and I know there's not going to be anything in my way. So they just throw a pulse out every now and again. So you can listen to these and work out potentially what species you have in the area, but also get a sense of whether or not they're foraging in the area or just commuting through or what kind of behaviour they're displaying. So we'll talk a lot about some different species tonight, but I wanted to introduce you to this one first because this is the one you can listen out for. And you can see this is the Atlas of Living Australia's records of this animal across Victoria. And you can see it has many, 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 many records relative to most other bat species because people are able to understand that that's what they're listening to because we know it's the only species that has a call low enough for us to be able to hear. Other common species, particularly in relatively urban areas, are things like long-eared bats. So this is a lesser long-eared. We have forest bats. This is a Gould's wattled bat. This one's a chocolate wattled bat. So lots of different species of insectivorous bats. And I'll talk a little bit about how we classify bats. And the term microbat that I'll drop in every now and again is not something we tend to use as often, but I'm a little bit old school like that and old habits die hard. So microbat has been a term we've applied to these insectivorous species for quite a long time, but I'll talk a bit about their evolution and why that might not be a term that we use so commonly anymore. So these are some of the really the animals that you might find regularly in the forests across Victoria. The smaller species you tend to find more in the forested environments relative to something larger like the white-striped freetail. And by large, I mean 20 grams and perhaps a body length of maybe 10 centimetres. So we're not talking huge creatures, but certainly in terms of the insectivorous species, the white-striped freetail is the largest that we have. Here's a range of other animals that you start to find as you get into some of the more intact parts of Victoria's landscapes, away from the heavily modified urban centres and out where you've got some green space and good habitat remaining. You get a whole range of different species. So we have species, I'll just point out a couple. So this is Myotis. This is a fishing bat. So the photo here is displaying this animal's beautiful long toes. So these bats are very good at coming in over water bodies, and they will use those long toes to scoop along the surface of the water, and they can catch insects on the surface or just under the surface, and they also catch small fish as well. So dietary studies have shown fish scales and things in their diet as well as insects. What else we got? Yellow-bellied sheathtail, another beautiful fast flyer, slightly different morphology to the white-striped freetail, but similar size. We've got a couple of other freetail bats. Now, when I say freetail, it's because they do actually have a tail that's free from the membrane at the back. And I've got some diagrams later that will help you distinguish between different bat species based on tail morphology. And then, of course, the long-eareds I've talked about as well. So feel free at any stage, if you've got questions about particular bat species, feel free to pop them in the chat and I can focus in on a couple if there are some that you're interested in. But let's have a look at where they get their name and the sort of evolutionary history and morphology of these animals. So bats are part of the order Chiroptera. So this is an order that was named for the major feature of this particular group, which is the fact that their hand has been modified into a wing. Okay, so that's what that term means, Chiroptera, hand wing. They are the only mammals that are capable of true flight, so powered flight in the way that birds are. And the reason that they've been able to achieve this is because they have a membrane that stretches between all of their fingers. So you can see that the finger bones are highly elongated relative to our own. And you also have a membrane that stretches from the little finger, from the pinky, all the way through to the ankle. Okay, so we think in terms of their evolutionary history that the development of this particular part of the membrane through to the ankle is the reason they were able to get the lift that was required for powered flight. You can see the huge amount of surface area that that creates to enable this to be a really functional wing and get them up off the ground. As I said, they've got 5 fingers like we do and 5 toes. Interestingly, their toes, the way that their ankle joint works is it's reversed relative to ours. So this allows them to hang upside down and face inwards to the structure that they're hanging on, which is a bit more protected than facing outwards. They've also got tendons within the feet that when they're relaxed are naturally curled and closed, and so they can hang without expending any energy. Bats have almost no muscle structure relative to our own anyway in the back legs because they're not carrying their body weight with these back legs anymore. This is one of the ways in which they've been able to drop the body weight that's required to enable them to be able to get up into the air. So if you think about some of the adaptations that you might be aware of in animals like birds that can fly are things like hollowed out bones. So they have very different bone structure where their internal structure rather than being solid bone is struts. Any engineers in the audience will understand how that can maintain strength compared to solid bone, but enable you to reduce weight. Bats have the same bone structure as we do. So they're not able to drop weight in that way. So they've lost muscle from the areas that they don't need it in order to drop the body weight and enable them to fly. They're mammals like we are, so they feed their young with milk. So bats have 2 nipples. There's no pouch. They don't have a pouch like the marsupials do. Mostly nocturnal, although if you go to a flying fox colony, this is the largest flying fox, this is actually a flying fox from Asia, but we have a similar sized flying fox, the grey-headed flying fox in Victoria. Mostly nocturnal. If you go to a flying fox camp, you'll find they're very active during the day, still squabbling and having a good conversation, but in terms of their foraging behaviour, bats are out at night. And contrary to popular belief, they are not blind. They have excellent vision. It's just that for many of these smaller bat species that are flying at speed, chasing insects on the wing at nighttime, vision is just not good enough. And so echolocation has enabled them to effectively hunt in those conditions rather than relying on vision. But not all bats can use echolocation, so we'll have a look at that as well. Bats are an incredibly diverse group. You find them right across the globe. Around 1,400 species is the current count, and they occur everywhere except the poles. So incredibly diverse group of animals, very adapted to a whole range of different environments. And you can see it's only the rodents that outnumber them in terms of species. Here's an amazing array of faces. So you can see, we've already had a look at a bit of diversity of Victoria's species, but just to give you a sense of how diverse the bat fauna are globally, incredible faces, excuse me, ears that can be bigger than the whole head, animals that come in beautiful white colour as well, and then the classic dog face that you see with the flying foxes and fruit bats, as well as these other interesting faces. So basically you can look at the face of a bat and work out whether or not it's likely to be an echolocator, because all of these amazing face facial structures are about either production of or receipt of that echolocation call. So these amazing nose leafs, for example, are ways in which the sound is modulated on the way out, and then you can affect what it is that you hear back again. We've got a vampire bat here, if you ever wondered what they look like. They're very cute, but we don't have them in Australia. Their diversity is, as many mammal species are, the richest near the equator. And I just wanted to introduce you to a few species. So we've got, across the bat fauna, one that's got the shortest genus and species name, which is the great evening bat, so Ear-io. We've got the tiniest bat here is the bumblebee bat. It's about 2.5 to 3 grams, very, very small. In New Zealand, we get bats that haven't given up flight but spend a lot of time on the ground, which, if you know anything about New Zealand's fauna, a lot of the birds did the same thing, gave up flight and spent a lot of time on the ground. So these animals have stubby little forearms and hind legs in order to crawl around and look for food on the ground, which was unusual. And here's our Honduran white bats. I pointed them out in the previous slide. So these ones are a tropical species that you find in Central America, and they basically make a tent out of a leaf for their roost. So they go through and they nibble all the leaf veins along here to let the leaf collapse and give them a shelter. So we don't have these species in Australia, but just gives you a bit of a sense of the diversity across the globe and how amazing these animals are. So 19 families globally within the order Chiroptera, and Australia's got about 8 of those families represented and around 80 species. So a really diverse group of bats in this country, and around about 23, somewhere between 23 and 25, depends on who you ask and what record you refer to, species of bats in Victoria. You can find out lots about bat diversity from the Australasian Bat Society. So I've just put this website up here, and we can share some of these resources after the talk as well. So they've built, so this is basically the peak body for bat research across Australia, and they've put together this fabulous interactive whereby you can click on any parts of Australia and get a sense of the number of species. Are they insectivorous bats or non-insectivorous? What are the represented species in that particular part of the country? So a really nice interactive to let you explore your particular part of Victoria if you're interested to see what is there. So let's come back to this idea of micro and megabats, the language that I will occasionally drop into using, but I'll tell you a little bit about why we think that that's not the most appropriate terminology for this group of animals anymore. So it used to be, and this is the case for most mammal species, and in fact lots of organisms, the first classification processes that we went through are based on morphology. So what does the animal look like? How does it behave? What kind of features can we see? And so we divvied up animals based on this sort of physical structures. But now a lot of the work that we're doing is based on the genetic information rather than physical features. So we're doing a lot of reorganisation and reclassification based on the information we now have about their DNA. But the original division we did was based on who can echolocate and who can't, and who's big and who's small. So megabats tended to be larger, and they were animals that relied on sight and smell to find their food, and they're not echolocating. This was the original classification process. You can see that the face shape here is much like a dog or a cat. So a good sense of smell, big eyes, able to see well, and they're looking for fruits and flowers. And then all of these animals here represent the diversity of the microbats, which tended to be smaller, but importantly, they were all echolocating. So that was the sort of initial division that we did. We being the royal we, it wasn't me that was involved. But when we look across these groups, we start to see some problems, and so people were looking for ways in which we could reclassify. So we can't say that the megabats are all bigger, because particularly microbats, the old name microbats, things like the false vampire bat and the ghost bats, they are larger than many of the megabat species. So that doesn't really work. In terms of who eat fruit, we definitely know that there are microbats out there that are consuming fruits and flowers. So that didn't really work either when we started to look more closely at the diversity. We had thought that none of the megabats were using hibernation or torpor as a form of controlling their metabolism, and I'll get back to that. But we see variation across both these groups in terms of who's using this and when. and even with echolocation, there are some fruit bats that we now know and are able to use ultrasonic sounds that they make through tongue clicking to be able to echolocate and navigate to some extent. So none of these sort of things that we originally considered to be divisions between these two groups really hold. There's lots and lots of exceptions. And so we needed to rethink this arrangement. And so the genetic data tells us much more clearly that this is how the groups are related to each other and the evolutionary history. So we now have two groups, the Interchiroptera and the Yangochiroptera. You can see the yin and the yang there hidden in those names. And what we can now know is that the rhinolophids, the horseshoe bats and the leaf-nosed bats and the ghost bats are evolutionarily more closely linked with the flying foxes and fruit bats, the Pteropodidae, than any of the other microbats, right? So we've got different evolutionary histories that tell us that these groups are more closely related than they are to the rest of the insectivorous species, even though we had previously thought that they were more similar. So expect to see this kind of terminology if you're looking up different bat species and looking up classifications. The Interchiroptera and the Yangochiroptera are the now accepted, mostly, terms that we would use to divide the bat groups up. When we look at evolutionary history, though, what this now tells us, which is actually super interesting, and lots of people are now trying to work this out, is that what we previously thought, this is our original organisation, was that we had an ancestor that then split into the Megachiroptera and the Microchiroptera, and only in the Microchiroptera did we get echolocation evolving. But if the case is actually that the bottom is true, then we're starting to wonder, okay, well, so was there a common ancestor that split and then the microbats developed echolocation? So maybe we had echolocation now, if this is our division, maybe we had echolocation evolve twice. Which is pretty interesting. Then the other thing to consider is, did we have a situation where powered flight potentially also evolved multiple times as well? So we're trying to now work out, where did echolocation occur? Did we see it evolve multiple times? Is this the correct idea still, where we've got echolocation evolving once and then working its way into different groups? Or are we seeing multiple evolutions of echolocation, or are we seeing echolocation back here and then potentially somewhere along this group is evolutionary line, we've lost the ability for echolocation? So lots of work now trying to work out, how do we know when each of these creatures first evolved? And one of the evidence lines that we can use is fossils, but it is somewhat limited. So this is just giving you a sense of the kinds of evidence that we might draw on. This is the oldest bat fossil that we have on record, about 52.5 million years old. It has long fingers, which we can think probably therefore tells us this animal was capable of flight. But when we look at the skull structure and the way the ear bones are set up, it suggests that it probably could not echolocate. So from the fossil evidence, we might say, okay, well, there we go. We got flight first, and then at some point after flight evolved, these animals, somewhere along the evolutionary history, evolved echolocation. But there's competing evidence that comes from DNA and also from people modelling the kinds of energy investments that would come from putting flight before echolocation or echolocation before flight. And so we've now got a situation where we've got sort of multiple lines of evidence that suggest that we probably had couple of points at which we had echolocation evolve, and possibly even a couple of points at which we had powered flight evolve. So if you're interested in the evolutionary history of bats and you want a paper to go and read, then I can send the full reference out. But Anderson and Ruxton in 2020 put a really nice review together that highlights all the different possible ways in which we think bats evolved and the relationships between flight and echolocation. So I will let you go away and have a look at those. But let's come back to our microbat species. So these are the animals that we recognise as being able to echolocate, and most of which are insectivorous. But we have ghost bats, which are carnivorous. Not that insectivorous bats are not carnivorous in the true sense, but the ghost bats are feeding on vertebrates. So ghost bats will hunt other bats, They will hunt frogs, they will hunt small reptiles and other small mammals on the ground as well, which is unusual across most of these bat species. Most of them are eating insects, and in most of the bats that we have in Victoria are feeding on insects. So that means that your insect fauna and maintaining good, diverse insect fauna is actually really important for microbat species. And it's one of the reasons that we think that we see a decrease in bat diversity as we come into highly urbanised areas. Because when we look at the insect diversity, we also see a massive decrease in insect diversity as well. So the food source is really important, and insects are really important. Oh, there's that sound again. I'll jump across. So if you're thinking about bat ID in the field, and if there's work starting to happen looking at monitoring animals in the field, then there's all sorts of things that we use. There's some great references out there to work out what bats we actually have in an area. So I've talked about calls already briefly, but I'll come back to that. But the colour, the size of the animal, ear and face shape are really important, and you start to recognise the particular face types of different groups. But also the tails. So I mentioned free tail already, so I thought I'd just show you what that looks like. So these are the free tail bats here, have their tailbone with skin over the top protruding out beyond the membrane. But we also have sheath tails. So there's one sheath tail that we find in Victoria where there's a little bit of tail protruding at the end, but otherwise it's hidden in the membrane. And then there's various other forms. The most common form that you'll see are the Vespertilionids. So this is a situation where the tail comes all the way and you get the membrane joining at the tip of the tail. So this is by far the majority of tail forms that you'll see of bats in Victoria. Most of what we have belong to the Vespertilionids or the evening bats. There's a range of different ecological niches that these bats fall into. I've already talked a little bit about diet, but it's not just about what they eat, but it's also about how they catch it. So bats can, even if all they're hunting is insects, there's different ways in which they can go about hunting those insects. I've mentioned the fishing bat already, Myotis. So they are trawlers. So that's dragging their feet through the water to collect food. And that's that same photo again showing their beautiful long toes. They have very hairy feet as well, gives them good sensation to work out when they've caught something. This animal here is demonstrating a process we call gleaning. So these animals tend to have incredibly accurate echolocation, incredibly agile flight. And so what they're doing is echolocating in such a way that they can distinguish food that's sitting still on a leaf. They can distinguish that as an insect or something that's worth foraging for in amongst all the clutter of the vegetation and leaves and sticks and things that they might be navigating through. So incredibly detailed images required for animals who are gleaners. This is a bit different to animals that are catching food on the wing. So most of the Vespertilionid species, like the Gould's wattle bat, the forest bats, will be out hunting on the wing like this. And part of the role of this tail membrane is to enable them to help scoop up the insects that they're catching on the wing mid-flight. And so they will be echolocating, tracking something that's also flying, navigating so that they can catch it, use that tail membrane to bring it up to their mouth, crunch it into bits. I don't know how they manage to keep flying and not crash while they're eating, because I don't know how you make sound while you've got a mouthful of food, but they manage to do it. Either they're swallowing incredibly quickly or they're managing to make calls in between mouthfuls. But they spend their entire time out on the wing, they're hunting on the wing, they're eating on the wing, and so they're flying consistently throughout the evening. The ghost bats I've mentioned as carnivores, so these are kind of sit and wait predators. They're perched, they're waiting for something, they're listening really intently to what's happening down on the ground for things scurrying about, and they'll fly in and pick up something off the ground and then fly back to a perch to consume it. You can see the prey is really large that these animals are catching. We've got the golden tipped bat in northern Australia. We don't have it in Victoria, but I thought I'd mention it because it's a spider specialist. So they're capable of echolocating in such a way that they can work out which side of the orb web the spider is on. So they'll fly up, flutter in front of the web. If they've worked out that the spider's on the other side, they'll fly around the other side of the orb web, work out where the spider is sitting, and then pounce. So these are quite specialised feeders. And then the one I've crossed out here is our vampire bat, because there are obviously blood feeders out in the bat world, but we don't have them in Australia. So vampire bats have specialised saliva for decreasing coagulation, allows the blood to flow freely, and they have very sharp teeth. So they're just putting a little nick in the skin of a very large animal generally, and then licking the blood up like you would see a cat or a dog lick water. But we don't have them in Australia. But happy to answer questions about vampire bats because they're pretty cool and highly social, really incredible. So let's come back to echolocation and talk a little bit more about how this works, and I'll show you some data that we can collect using echolocation. So sending out a pulse of sound, receiving the echo, and interpreting a visual image, if you like. Their brain is doing some conversion to be able to navigate in 3D. So the pulse comes from either their mouth or their nostrils. So we have different groups of bats are either mouth screamers or nose screamers. How you scream through your nose, I don't know. I can't do it, but there's plenty of bats out there that can. So generally speaking, the nose screamers will have amazingly elaborate. So things like the horseshoe bats and the leaf nose bats will be nose screamers, very elaborate face shapes to make a particular sound and control that sound as it comes out of the nose. Most of the Vespertilionid species that you'll find in central Victoria are all mouth screamers. So you'll see them open their mouth when they're echolocating. You won't hear the sound if you happen to have them visible to you at the time because it's too high, but you'll see them open their mouth to make that sound. At the same time, they've got to shut their ears because otherwise they'll deafen themselves. So that sound is incredibly loud. So be grateful that our hearing is not quite so acute. They will go through with their echolocation search phase calls. So this is the sort of less frequent calls that they make as they're just navigating through the environment. And so Australian microbats range in the frequency that they call at from 11 kilohertz, which is the white-striped freetail that we were listening to, all the way up to the dusky leaf-nosed bat, which is the highest frequency, around 160 kilohertz. So incredible range in terms of the sounds that they can make, and that changes the visual image, if you like, or the interpretation they can make of their surroundings. And I've mentioned the complex facial structures. So nose leaves, large ears allow for complex echolocation and at producing a constant frequency so they can do interpretation. So as I said, we can use calls to do ID. So if you can collect calls from the environment, you can have some sense of presence, absence of species, or maybe some levels of relative abundance between sites. It's hard sometimes because you don't know whether or not you're just hearing the same bat going back and forth, or if you've got different animals. But you can see all these different call shapes. This is Gould's wattle bat here. It's classic sort of scooped shape. And then with some of the other species, we'll have a hook shape or a very tall, straight shape. So this is lesser long-ears, very tall sound that covers lots of different frequencies. So you can think about that as giving them sort of a better, more detailed picture of their environment because you're covering more frequencies and getting a more informative echo coming back relative to something that's quite flat. So the animals that fly out in the open, like the white-striped freetail, will have a really flat call. You can think about it in the same way as if you were to strip out a whole range of the colours that you interpret your visual world with. So if only your eyes were sensitive to blue light, for example, you wouldn't get nearly the same detail as if you're looking right across the visual spectrum when you're interpreting the world. So this idea of having a really steep call gives you better detail compared to having a really flat call that's only running on a couple of frequencies. So the call frequency will change depending on what they're doing. So you can see here, this is actually an animal that was coming in to drink. So this is what it looks like when a bat's coming down to drink. They just drag their tongue through the water, but they've got to make a decision about exactly how far away from the water they are so that they don't crash, because it's really hard for bats to then take off out of the water. They can do it, but they'd rather not. So you can see the search phase here with some steeper calls to allow them to judge where they are. And then as they get close to the target, you'll see that call sequence speed up and then it will slow down again and flatten out as they go back into search phase again. We also see changes in the morphology of the animals. So thinking about this idea of the call shape changing depending on how they're foraging and where they're foraging, we also see some body shape changes as well, particularly in the wings. So animals that are dealing with really cluttered environments and having to navigate and flutter and pause and stall in the air and change direction will have quite short, stubby wings. So we'll see, for instance, the long-eareds will be down this end of the spectrum. They've got much shorter wings than something like a white-striped freetail, which is out in the open and will have long, narrow wings, right? This is about speed and navigating long distances. Rather than being able to turn really quickly and change direction. So lots of different wing shapes as we look at the way in which animals are adapted to different parts of the environment. So out on the edge in the open or in really cluttered environments. So you can have a look at that when you've got bats that you're doing monitoring with, and think about what's the kind of environment that they need, what's their wing shape, what's their call look like, what does that tell me about their behaviour and their habitat and their needs. Bats also, as very small animals, have to be very careful about how they manage their metabolism. So when you're a very small animal, you lose heat really rapidly. You've got a big surface area relative to the volume that you have inside your body. And so the heat that you're generating through your metabolic activity leaves your body really easily. So that means that when there's not a lot of food around, you need to consume, you're going to be using more energy than you're able to replace. So you have to find a way to lower your metabolism so that you can survive through periods where there's not much insect activity. So I'm sure you've noticed in summer when it's warm, there'll be lots of bugs out in the evening, whereas in winter, you might go outside and really not notice much flying around at all. So for bats, this matters. If that's their prey, they need to be able to manage their metabolic rate so they can survive those periods where there's not a lot of insect activity and not a lot of food. You've probably heard the term hibernation. We think about bears and hedgehogs and various things going through periods of hibernation. Hibernation and torpor. So torpor is the word we tend to use when we're talking about what bats are doing. Hibernation and torpor are the same thing on a spectrum. So they're ways in which you can reset your body's temperature and manage it at a level that lowers your metabolic rate and therefore your food needs. So it's arbitrary, the distinction between them. Don't worry about them. They don't think of them as separate. Just think about them as a spectrum of ways in which animals can manage their metabolic rate. So I'll talk about torpor with bats. So let's have a look at what this looks like. So deep torpor, you can think about them as hibernators if you want to, but deep torpor is for animals that are dealing with relatively long periods. It could be several months where they're really not going to get a lot of food. So this is true for bats in Victoria. And so they have to go through periods of deeper torpor where they have to manage their metabolism at a really low rate so that they don't have to eat. It's really important that bats put on weight going into winter in order to be able to do this. If we have a look, let's have a look at this top graph first. This just shows you the change in heart rate. So this is an animal at rest that's not in torpor. So they have incredibly fast heart rates. So this animal sitting at rest, just fully active but not flying, around 450 beats a minute. When these animals are in flight, their heart rate can go up to 1,000 beats a minute, so incredibly fast. This animal then, in the same animal in torpor, we can see their heart rate slow right down. That's now beating at 25 beats a minute. Their body temperature, subcutaneous body temperature, is around 15 degrees. So they then maintain that body temperature in such a way that they don't need to eat very often. This allows them to get through the winter. They will have to come out of torpor every now and again to drink. If there's a warm, so one of those odd winter nights that happens where it's a little bit warmer and there's a few insects out, they'll come out and try and forage. But generally speaking, they're in torpor for weeks at a time, potentially. This graph down here just shows you the change in oxygen consumption. So you can see that these animals are dropping right down. Their oxygen consumption, their metabolic rate is dropping right down, and they are able to manage that. You can see them, they bring themselves back out of torpor, can drop back down again. So it's highly controlled. This is not something that the animal is doing in response to the environment in a sort of a non-voluntary way. They're making clear decisions about when it is they use torpor or when they don't. Another thing that's really important for microbats is their social structure. And there's lots still to learn about the social structure of bats, but we've got I guess, some idea about how they spend time together. And this is really important in terms of the ways in which we think about conserving habitat for bats as well. We have to think about how they're having to interact with each other and how we provide the right environments for these social structures to persist. So this is a diagram that I put together from bats that live in Melbourne, but you would see similar sorts of arrangements of bats throughout Victoria. So what we've got here is each little node represents an individual. So all the blue individuals are females, all the green individuals are males, and the connections between them, the closer they are together, the more time these individuals were found using the same roosting site. Okay, so these animals are looking for places to hide during the day, and I'll talk a little bit about roosts in a moment, but we can use these roosting sites to work out, okay, well, how are these animals associating with each other? Who do they spend time with? And what does this mean for the kinds of habitat we need to preserve? So you can see the females are forming roosting groups, but they're relatively loosely associated. These are not genetic links. These are not family groups. These are animals that are spending a bit of time roosting together, and then they change and they'll roost with someone else, and then they'll come back again, and then they'll change again. The males are much more likely. These are all our Nigel No friends. Sorry for anyone whose name is Nigel. That was not an intended slur on you. These are all individuals that were never found roosting with anyone else. And you can see most of the males have big distances between other individuals because they're mostly roosting alone. So females in social groups, males roosting alone is the general pattern we see with microbats. But we can also look and see that this tells us, this is just sort of the setup that you can use to try and monitor this. So if people are interested and you've got research permits and opportunities to collaborate and do research, then we can think about what that might look like. And I can share the kinds of things that we did to monitor artificial roosting boxes to work this sort of stuff out. But you can also learn a little bit about how this social structure looks across space. So it's not just about who's roosting with who, but it's about which boxes are important or which roosting sites are important to which groups of animals. And you can reveal what would otherwise have been fairly cryptic arrangements of these groups of bats, right? So you might think this was about that's about 1 kilometre, something like that, long reserve in urban Melbourne. And you can see, even though there's not a lot of habitat left here, you've still got social structuring that is very distinctly dividing up the population into a group of bats that live here and a group of bats that live here. So losing this habitat here would take away a whole segment or subsegment of this population. But you don't necessarily know that until you can see the arrangement and the way in which these animals are using roosting sites through the environment. So really important that we have some idea of this. And the reason that most of this social structuring is occurring is to do with both the management of thermal biology, so that idea of torpor and how you can cope with periods without food, but also reproduction. So we see that social structuring becoming sort of at its peak, if you like, through the reproductive season. For most bats, mating occurs in autumn. So we've just been through, or we're sort of halfway through the mating period at the moment for most vespertilionid bats. And then the females will store the sperm. So they will carry the sperm inside their body all of winter while they're torpid, and then they make a decision at some point as the weather starts to warm as to when they want to get pregnant. For Gould's wattle bat, they have twins. This is really unusual, though. There's not many bats that have twins. Most of them, it's single young every year, and those bats are really large. So the females give birth late spring, early summer. 1 or 2 massive young, and when I say massive, I mean, 25 to 30% of the mother's body weight is the young when they're born. They're huge. The females have to carry them roost to roost while they're too small to be able to cope being left alone. So when they've not got fur like this, they don't have the ability to regulate their own body temperature, so they have to go with mum everywhere. But once they've got a bit of fur on them, then they get crèche. So part of this social system is to crèche the young together. They can survive in the roost while the parents are out foraging, or the mum's out foraging. The dads have nothing to do with it. They just happen to hang in the group, maybe, if they're tolerated. Weaned about 4 to 6 weeks. So then they'll follow mum around and they'll be foraging with mum, learning how to find insects, catch them on the wing, and then they're independent. By the time they hit winter, they've got to put enough weight on to get through their first winter, and we suspect quite a few young don't make it through that first winter. But bats can live a really long time. We've got records from a research program in Siberia of a bat that was banded and recaptured 41 years later. This is a wild animal. Most of the bats that we've banded in Victoria, average sort of lifespan in the wild is 10 to 15 years, but that's still a very long time for a very small animal. So think of them as long-lived, slow reproducing. They just have one young every year. Very different to how we might think about mice and things that are really rapid reproducers that would be of similar size. The kind of place that we find bats roosting. So I'll talk about tree hollows in a moment. They're really important, but artificial structures bats will make the most of, people's houses potentially, the culverts and drains that we put in, various other anthropogenic substitutes for what would have been caves, but also tree hollows as well. So most of the bats in central Victoria are reliant on tree hollows for their roosting sites. So this is where they go to get shelter. This is where they go to raise their young. This is where they go to regulate their body temperature, particularly through the winter months. That's very, very important. They provide a stable microclimate, give bats protection from the weather, but also from predators. And the bats are looking for, if you're thinking about providing hollows or trying to think about how artificial hollows work, they like hollows where it's just wide enough for them to get their heads through. Bats have very flat skulls, and so you're talking an entrance diameter of 1 to 1.5 centimetres only. Really narrow entrance slits are really important so that they know nothing can follow them in. As many of you would know, hollow-bearing trees have been lost for much of our landscape. What's left is really important to preserve, and trying to think about how we get the next generation of hollows coming through is really important. Bats are adaptable. This is a roosting site of a Gould's wattle bat that we tracked in Melbourne. So this is Kings Way. If anyone knows Melbourne, this is one of the busiest thoroughfares that comes into the city. And this tree on the median strip was being used as a roost. So they don't mind a bit of traffic if they've been adaptable enough to cope with the urbanisation, and there's a few species that cope, but many, many that don't, then they will find hollows where they're available. But certainly we have a responsibility to try and get as many back into the landscape as we possibly can. And this gives you a sense of where bats are at the moment. So vulnerable species, mostly in the northern parts of Australia, we see most of our vulnerable, endangered and critically endangered bats. But the ones that cross into Victoria, Corbyn's long-eared bat, the large pied bat, and the grey-headed flying fox are species that we can think of as having some responsibility for in Victoria. And then we've got some species, unfortunately, that have gone extinct. So the Christmas Island pipistrelle I'll talk a little bit about, and the Lord Howe Island long-eared bat are the two that we are aware of that have gone extinct. But with animals that are so small and so cryptic and that we're only really starting to learn a lot about, there's a possibility that there were bat species here in Australia that we just weren't aware of that have gone extinct and we didn't even know. So plenty for us still to learn in terms of being able to protect these animals. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Christmas Island pipistrelle because I think it's a really important story that helps us think about how we can take responsibility for these animals and how easy it is for them to be lost. So this animal went extinct in 2009. There was a long period of tracking these animals through their decline. And there was eventually, after a lot of pressuring of the government, some resources put into sending a research team out onto Christmas Island in order to try and capture a colony. But the only thing they came back with was this. So that's the last recorded call of the Christmas Island pipistrelle. They didn't catch any animals while they were there, and they're now presumed to be extinct because we've never heard them again, and no one's seen one since. So really sad for the researchers that were out there, but an incredible lesson that if we're going to act to save these species, we cannot wait till crisis point. We cannot wait till the last minute because we may end up in a situation like this again where we get there only to observe the extinction with no ability to be able to reverse it. And obviously Australia's got a pretty poor extinction record, plenty of species that we have not managed to do well by along the way. Oh, that's playing again. So lots of importance for you as people that are participating in ecological restoration, potentially acting as passionate volunteers. Encourage you to keep that up. Here's us out doing volunteer work with people that are helping us monitor bat boxes. We wouldn't have been able to collect the data that we have if we had not had access to lots of passionate people willing to participate in the kind of research that we were doing. So I'm mindful that we are coming close to the end. So I might actually stop there and let people ask questions rather than keep throwing more at you. I want to leave you with that message of please stay involved, please stay involved. Your involvement is so important. And I will let you guide where we go next. So I'll stop sharing my screen, I think.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa. And yeah, really pertinent point to finish up on. We've got a bunch of questions in the chat, so I'll jump straight into those and get through as many as we can before everyone has to go off for dinner. First question was from 6-year-old Ella, who's listening and wondering if the bats smile.
If bats smile, I like to think that they do, because when I'm holding bats in the hand, particularly the Gould's wattle bat has a really characteristic pose that it will put on where it's got its little teeth out. What it's actually doing is echolocating, trying to figure out where it is. And it's also got a little buzz that it makes, which is really it communicating with me saying, would you mind letting me go, please? I'd like to go home. But they have a little teeth chatter and a little buzz, which makes them look like they're smiling. But I can guarantee you that they would quite like to be let go. It's not a real smile, but it looks like a smile. So in some photos of bats, it might look like they're smiling, but they're actually just communicating. They're either echolocating or they're making that little buzz that is, please let me go.
Right. Some of them certainly look like they're smiling.
Yeah,
Charlie was wondering what specific species might expect to see around Heathcote, if there are just a handful off the top of your head.
Yeah, so white-striped freetail, definitely. Gould's wattle bat, definitely. You'll have both the large and the little forest bat, the lesser long-eared, the chocolate wattled bat. What else will you definitely get? Probably the Jeffrey-eye, no, Gould's long-eared, sorry. I've named Jeffrey-eye already, that's the lesser long-eared, but Gould's long-eared you'll get as well, that's 7. There'll probably be a couple of others that will be less common, but if you were to go out, so when I went trapping last in central Victoria, we're in Tatura, and we caught both the lesser long-eared and the chocolate wattle bat, just a couple of, like we only had half an hour after dusk putting traps up, and got those 2 in quick succession. But definitely you would, if you were out with a bat detector, you'd be expecting to hear something along those 7 and possibly more. So plenty of bats around Heathcote for sure.
Right. From 9-year-old Fion, sorry, Cola, if I pronounced that wrong. Where do bats come from?
Where do bats come from? That's excellent. So if we go evolutionarily speaking, bats come from animals that look a little bit like shrews or moles, little ground-dwelling creatures. And we think the bat ancestor had webbing between its fingers, but hadn't yet evolved the membrane that goes all the way to the ankle. So we think they're most closely related to shrews, things like that. So if you Google a shrew, have a look. They've got a little pointy face, little tail, little ground-dwelling animal. That's where bats have come from. In terms of how they ended up in Australia, they evolved a long, long, long time ago when Australia was still connected to lots of other continents. And so they would have flown here when Australia was not an island. Yeah.
Right. We've had a couple of responses in the chat to this one, but just to confirm, do bats inhabit people's homes? And I guess how common is that?
Yes, they do. Yeah, so if they can see a way in to a roof space or something like that, think about the insulation that you have in your roof and the kind of environment that creates that would mimic the kind of thermal stability that they would get in a big old tree. Then your roof or the walls of your house can provide really excellent bat habitat. For some people, that's great. They love it. They're just excited that the bats have moved in. For others, you may find you get ceiling staining or other things or smell or noise that is not preferred. And so there are opportunities to be able to get bats out of roofs with one-way doors. So happy to have a chat to people if anyone's got a particular issue that they're dealing with and they want some advice. There are ways to do it humanely, and times of the year that you want to think about doing it now actually being a good time, so that you're not going to end up with a bunch of dead baby bats that you've trapped in your roof or something along those lines. Yep.
Yeah, great. Adriana was asking for the paper that has the yin and yang classification.
Yes, I can
Is it
send out
reference to that?
yeah, maybe Chris, would it be helpful if I gave a list of papers that might be useful? And yeah, I can send that one as well as the one that's got the evolutionary history in it. So people might want to do some reading. Yeah, happy to do that.
Yeah, great. Yeah, if you send those through to me, I can pass them on.
Yep.
Adriana was also wondering, are prey able to hear echolocation sounds,
Yes, they
or is that
are.
outside of the range?
Yeah, no. We've got good evidence, and this is what we call an evolutionary arms race, that there are species of insects that have evolved the ability to be able to detect that sound wave as it comes up behind them. And so they will go into an evasive flight pattern. So you'll see them drop and change direction really rapidly in the hopes that they can evade being captured. So we do certainly have examples of moths and beetles that are capable of detecting that they're being hunted, and they will go into an evasive maneuver to try and avoid being caught. Yeah.
Cool, great. Carla wanted to know how much food do they need? What sort of percentage of their body weights are bats consuming?
It's about half their body weight each night that they're out eating. So if you imagine what it would take, I mean, I'm somewhere around 55 kilos or so. So if I think about trying to consume a meal that's 25 to 30 kilograms of food in one night while I'm flying, that makes me feel quite ill. But for bats, that's generally what they're out consuming. So if you think about a small forest bat or something like that, they're often feeding on things like mosquitoes. That's a lot of insects that they're hoovering up every night. So a real ecological benefit to us as humans, as well as just being part of that functional system.
Right. Helen was wondering if individual bats have distinctive voices.
Um, so yes, in that the call shape, if you were able to bring that down to human hearing range and play it, they would all sound different. They're all at different frequencies, and they move through different frequencies, so they would sound different. Because they're in the ultrasonics, we can't listen to them. But if we think about the flying foxes for a minute, in terms of the voices that we can hear, we know they've got about 23 words in their language. So individual flying foxes are speaking to each other about different things with a simple language. And certainly bats can interpret the identification of an individual through call. They're also using smell. So we don't know how much each of those allow bats to identify one individual for another. But if you imagine a mum coming back after foraging and there's thousands of bats in a cave or thousands of bats in a camp of flying foxes, they have to be able to use both sound and smell to navigate and find their young. So certainly in terms of that communication between mother and baby bat, there are individual voices that are being used to help that identification.
Cool. And then follow-on questions from Helen and Kay are both interested in sociality of bats. Are they social animals and just social groupings, I guess, within colonies?
Yeah, so we call it fission fusion society. So that's because what you get over time is groups of animals coming together, but then separating and coming together again. So fission fusion's the official name that we give it. So yes, they are social. Most bats, most of the Vespertilionids, or the bats that you would find around sort of the Heathcote Central Victorian region, are not social in the sense that they are connecting with the same individuals over long periods of time. We find that most relationships between bats last for a couple of years at most, and then they tend to sort of fall apart. And they're not based on genetics. So individuals who are genetically related are not staying in touch in the way that family groups in some mammals work. Bats, they don't have that kind of relationship. Vampire bats are different though. They do have highly structured social arrangements. They will care for each other's young. They will keep tabs on individuals that are not food sharing appropriately, and they'll shun them and stop feeding them in the way that they would feed others in the colony. So there are some bats that have really complex social structures, but most of the bats in Victoria, it's what we call fission fusion. So they're kind of loose associations more so than strong relationships. Yeah.
Cool. Kay also wanted to know if is there a collective noun for bats, and do you know it? If so,
Good question. We call flying fox, the collective for them is a colony because they all roost together, and we would use the same for the roosting bats in a tree hollow or a cave. We would call it a colony. But there's probably maybe for a flying group of bats, there might be another collective noun. Maybe people can have a look and see if there's others. But yeah, colony is the one I'm familiar with.
Yep. And you sort of touched on this, but in a maternity cave or roost, are the females and males segregated in different areas of the roost or the cave?
Yeah, they usually are. So the males, and this is the same in a flying fox colony too, the adult males are differentiated. So the adult males tend to be more likely to be off by themselves. They'll be in a separate part of the cave or a separate part of the colony in trees. But the juvenile males will be with the mothers. So you kind of have the juveniles and the females together, and they'll cluster, and then the males tend to be by themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jerry was wondering if there is anything known around the effect of potential sound pollution on bats in a similar way that the effects of light pollution on birds and things like that.
Yeah, so light pollution and sound pollution actually. So it's different for different species. So some species are much more susceptible to noise pollution, and they will avoid, particularly like if you've got a highway going through a region or something like that, we find that the types of species that you find foraging in those areas changes. So things like the lesser long-eared and Gould's long-eared, things that hunting in complex environments and need quite a detailed echolocation return in order to forage, find that noise disturbance much more disruptive, and you'll find they move away from those areas. But things like Gould's wattlebat, white-striped free-tail bats, I mean, they're hunting right through the centre of Melbourne. They don't seem to be disturbed in the same way by noise and light pollution. Possibly their behaviour has changed. If we had enough information about them and made some comparisons, we might see some differences. But certainly they tolerate the kinds of noise and light that humans produce much more readily than many of the other species that we see vacate these disturbed environments. So noise and light impact these animals. Yep.
Yeah, interesting. Esther was interested in learning about the monitoring of bats, determining that social structure. So if there's a resource on that could potentially be distributed as well, that'd be great.
Yeah. So I can send you a couple of papers. There's only a couple of research groups around the globe that have done it. So yeah, it takes a little bit of work and a bit of money. So it would be something to have to put aside. Yeah.
Great. Another question from young Fion asking, what is the difference between a flying fox and a bat?
Yeah, so a flying fox is a type of bat. So bat is the term we use for all of them. And then a flying fox is a particular type of bat that doesn't echolocate. It's got good vision. It's got a face that looks like a fox or a dog. And they're usually quite big. So the flying foxes, the biggest one that we have is the grey-headed flying fox, and it weighs about 1 kilogram and has about a 1 metre wingspan if you stretch its wings right out. So really big. So a flying fox is a type of bat.
Cool. And Esther had a comment, which I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, around the idea that individual bats sort of do have, in some way, different voices and that they can recognize one another. I guess, would they be different enough that theoretically you could use audio acoustic recording to actually differentiate between individuals and come up with some sort of individual presence absence and
Yeah, that's a
abundance
great
sort of
question.
metric?
I suspect the difficulty will be that most of the differences that we see in terms of that identity and recognition comes from the social calls that they make, which are within our hearing range, rather than the echolocation calls that we use to monitor bats out in the environment when they're, flying and looking for food. It's possible that individuals have differences in the way they echolocate as well, but I haven't seen any instrumentation or anyone figure out that there's ways to tell them apart. Thinking, kind of in the way that you might with whale song or something where you can pick individuals. I think the most likely differences you pick up would be with the social call. So you'd have to get into their roost and listen rather than be out monitoring with a bat detector.
Yeah, okay. Makes sense. couple from Kay to finish up on. So first of all, Kay's let us know that it's a cauldron of bats, or for flight when
Excellent.
they're in
Love
flight,
it.
it's a cloud of bats. So thank you, Kay, for
Very good.
enlightening us on that one. And then Kyla has asked if you can sort of finish us off with a quick overview of what we can do to support the bats living around us, whether it's, nest boxes, how we can support insect populations, that sort of thing.
Yep. I'm very happy to. So insect populations, think about the diversity of plant species that you're providing and how that supports the life cycles of different groups of insects. So have you got flowering bushes and things that bring insects in, things like sweet basaria and the good stuff that we know brings insects in, as opposed to always favouring big nectar feeding birds. Think about roosting sites. So if you've got big old hollow bearing trees, there's actually ways, and I know we often have conflict between human safety and being able to maintain some of these big old trees, particularly where it's getting close to human habitation. So there are ways you can prune trees or take off dangerous branches that can still allow for that hollow to form. So the Australasian Bat Society has actually got a nice little fact sheet that shows you how to do some pruning in ways that means that that hollow will then still provide a roosting site while you've taken off sort of the weight of the branch and the dangerous aspect. Roosting boxes can be really effective, but we know that it's a really limited number of species that will use them. So I can guarantee you, if you put roosting boxes up and bats start using them, it'll be Gould's wattle bat. You might get some forest bats and white striped freetails, and that will be about it. It's really hard to design roosting boxes for things like long-eared bats. They're looking for things like fishes under bark. There's people who have had success in Queensland with long-eared species, but we haven't in Victoria yet. So boxes is only part of the solution. They require maintenance. You need to keep things like ants out of them, are a big problem for bat boxes. Spiders just fill them up. So think about where you're going to put the roosting box, somewhere it can be maintained and monitored. And then probably the other thing to think about is, just building people's awareness that these species are here, that they're an important part of the ecology, and we need to think about learning more about what they require to be able to protect them. The connectivity of the landscape is important for some species, but not for others, because they're able to fly. They're less impacted by fragmentation, but where the fragmentation becomes problematic is where you lose the roosting sites and you lose the insect diversity. So thinking about supporting those two in particular will be really important to keep bats in the landscape.
Great. Well, that will wrap us up for tonight. On behalf of everyone in attendance, thank you, Lisa, for your time and really fascinating presentation. Thank everyone who's attended and for some really great questions. I think the Q&A is always the best part of these webinars. And yeah, for those of you who missed part of it, joined later, anything like that, this will be distributed, the recording, and it'll be up on our website as well. And feel free to subscribe to our email list and follow our socials to keep up to date with our next webinars. We've got a few more really exciting ones lined up coming up. So thank you again, Lisa, and yeah, hopefully see you all again soon.